everyone to the Ask an Architect show. Here with me today, Hiroshi Jacobs. Hiroshi, thanks for joining the show.
Sure.
Appreciate you being here. Hiroshi, real quick for the audience who may not know you, kind of 15, 20 seconds. Who are you and what are you doing right now?
My name is Hiroshi Jacobs. I'm an architect with Studios Architecture, practicing here in DC.
Cool.
Very busy with projects at work of all different scales, and I also do art on the side as a kind of side project that I'm very interested in.
Definitely. I want to get into the art a lot because I think that's a really unique aspect of your background and what you're doing. But I also want to talk about Studios. Studios is actually a really popular firm among a lot of our audience, especially here in the DC area. And I think you're the first person to be on the show from Studios. So can you tell us a little bit about what it's like there? What's the culture like? What kind of projects are you working on? You mentioned a variety of projects. Tell us what it's like.
Yeah. Studios is I would say it's a medium-sized firm. There's probably 300 designers worldwide.
Okay.
Our DC office has about 55 architects in the office. It was started in the 80s as a kind of tech startup interior design firm for the most part. The first client was Google. Apple.
Apple. It's not a bad first client.
In the 80s, and then it sort of grew into this kind of interior new office interior design firm basically from there. And then for the past decade or so, we've been doing a lot more base building architecture work. So it's really kind of an interiors firm that grew into a base building firm, and I think the sort of ideals of interior design really influence the base building design that we do as architects.
Sure.
So it's sort of an inside out kind of design process that the firm employs, really thinking about the user first, and then the architecture. The architecture is kind of what grows out of that.
Interesting. That's a unique perspective. I like the inside out phrase you used there. So what's the philosophy at Studios in terms of design? I mean, you guys do seem to be on the cutting edge a lot of times. I see you guys on very high profile, very edgy projects. You mentioned Apple, even in the 80s, was a very advanced tech company. So what's the philosophy like? What's it like to be designing at Studios?
Well, I think it's a fairly unique place to be designing because, if you look at the work that Studios produces, it's kind of all over the place. There's a lot of different aesthetics that are employed, and that is evidence of the fact that the firm is a very kind of bottom-up design process. So each team comes to a project and thinks about the goals of the project rather than the sort of goals of the firm in terms of defining an aesthetic. And so what you get is design teams that have their own aesthetic, have their own kind of goals for that project, and that bears itself out in the work. So it's a very collaborative type of design environment, much more collaborative than I think a lot of other firms are. A lot of firms will say that they're collaborative, but sometimes it's a guy at the top just giving a sketch. I think Studios is definitely not like that, and that's why I like it so much. It's very kind of collaborative design process.
I can see that. So essentially, you're not going to get the same type of design, or you're not going to see a lot of the same elements between designs at Studios.
Right.
There's not one particular brand of project, so to speak.
And I think that helps us be a little bit more forward-thinking because it's people who may not have a lot of experience influencing the design, and they're sort of bringing new ideas that are kind of out there in the world to a particular design project that might not have happened if it was the same person designing everything all the time.
You mentioned the collaborative nature, and if you're bringing new designs to the table each time, I imagine you have to have a pretty interdisciplinary set of individuals, people with a broad range of backgrounds. Is that what you find there? I mean, what's the staff base like, the employee base? Is it people all over the map?
It is. I mean, we don't have an engineering department in-house, so it's not interdisciplinary in that way, but each person at Studios is really a generalist, and will work on all different project types. I've worked on anything from interiors work to base building work, education, office, residential.
So a lot of variety.
A lot of variety, and that's very intentional by the firm. They want people to get experience in each one of those different areas. And so you kind of move around a lot in between projects, which gives each person kind of their own kind of generalist sense of kind of what's happening in the industry and how to sort of work through different types of problems of different types of projects.
Yeah, I would imagine that would make you a very broad, skilled, capable architect pretty quickly if you have that much exposure to different things. So when you get in there, you've been there now, what, 5+ years?
Yeah.
So that's a long time for somebody, in the early part of their career to be at one firm. Does the variety inspire you? Does that motivate you? Does that keep it fresh for you? Is that one of the reasons you've been able to stay around for so long and do well there?
Yeah, definitely. Those, the things that I mentioned about collaboration, and then, the kind of generalist idea of architecture is really important to me. I'm very interested in becoming a kind of well-rounded architect, and so going to a firm like this that, you work on CA and you also work on concept design, you work on master planning, all of the different phases and project types that we work on, I've worked on, and so that's really important to me.
Did that help you get to your license really quickly too, because you had such variety? Or?
It didn't.
Okay.
It took me a while to get licensed.
Okay.
I just got licensed maybe 2 years ago.
Okay.
And I've been practicing for 10 years.
Gotcha.
So it took me quite a while, but I did it eventually.
Yep, you got it done. That's all that matters. So you kind of have a very interesting, I don't know what you call it, a side project or a side exploration, for lack of a better word. You have something that you've started called Hijack. So I won't even preempt it. Tell our audience what Hijack is and what it's all about.
Well, Hijack is basically an art collaborative that I started. I basically will collaborate with lots of different people, friends of mine, students, to create art projects, usually temporary art projects, public art, so large-scale installations in different parts of the country and the city. Recently it's been turning into a little bit more permanent artwork. Started working with a few developers.
Thing, right?
Yeah. No, it's always sad when you spend so much time on something and then 2 weeks later it's gone.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's a certain value to that, but it's also nice to see things last for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I imagine that's an indication of success that your projects are becoming more permanent. So give us some examples. What are some really unique projects that you are, really proud of?
I think that the most interesting project to me has been a project that I did for Georgetown Glow a couple of years ago.
Okay.
I did a large-scale kind of light tunnel installation for this thing called Georgetown Glow, which is a month-long light art festival that Georgetown Business Improvement District puts together in the winter. They've been doing it for a couple of years now. And the project was really interesting. It was a kind of big hit on Instagram. And then after Georgetown Glow, I had this huge thing that I was like, I couldn't fit this in my house. It was probably 40 feet long and 10 feet tall. So I talked to the guys at DuPont Underground, which is an abandoned underground trolley station here in DC under DuPont Circle, and they're like, bring it down here. We'll set it up in the tunnels. So it's actually down in the tunnels in DuPont Underground now.
Okay.
So people coming down into this sort of abandoned space will see this sort of glowing light tube inside of the underground.
So I think a lot of people in our audience think this would be fascinating to start, probably have similar interests, probably think that a lot of their architecture, they'd like to transition into art in some way on their own. So how do you get started with something like this? So you have this artistic ability, you have this interest, you want to start creating things. What do you do? How do you formalize that? Where do you get projects? How do you find those projects? How do you make it something real?
Sure. I think it all starts with kind of what your ambitions are for, why you're doing this.
Sure.
For me, it was, art, especially this sort of temporary art, is a kind of quick way to test out ideas that, would take you months to years in architecture to do. So it's a very fast kind of idea testing ground for me, and it was really an experimental project for me. And so that sort of started in grad school. Friend of mine and I, we we entered this competition actually for furniture design for the balconies of the school that we were at, and instead of doing furniture, we decided to do like a canopy type project. So we used really interesting materials to create this kind of dynamic sculptural canopy for that, and then that sort of grew into this kind of series of projects that we did down in New Orleans, and then eventually here in DC. And I knew I wanted to keep doing this, so at the end of grad school, I decided to just sort of apply for some of the different open calls that were being put out by galleries here in DC.
Okay.
And that's when I started working with Cultural DC, which is a nonprofit sort of arts incubator type program here in DC. They have a gallery and accepted our proposal to do an installation in their gallery, and and they're very well connected in the city and in the arts world. So that's how it sort of started growing.
As you're telling this story, it reminds me a lot about how architects simply get started in their own practice. It's reaching out, it's looking for competitions initially, it's looking for opportunities, which at the beginning may or may not be actual full-scale buildings or whatever it is, and then you network from there. It sounds like you found the right organizations to team with, where you were able to meet people who showcased opportunities for you.
Yeah, it was very fortuitous in that way.
Yeah.
Just meeting the right people is everything, I think, in this world.
I mean, serendipity will take you a long way, especially in business. So I think a lot of what you just said applies to even traditional architecture. But if you go to your website, the Hijack website, which is it hijack
dash creative.
All right, hijack-creative. Check that out. And it's HIJAC.
That's right.
Right. Okay. So there's a lot of work there. There's a lot of stuff going on. What's your long-term goal for this? I mean, is it eventually, if these projects become more permanent and then perhaps they become bigger, does it eventually become a design firm of its own? Is that a long-term option?
I don't know. I think I'm just kind of seeing where it goes right now. That isn't necessarily my goal with it. I do want to, I'm very much interested in practicing at all different scales in architecture, and I think it will take a long time for that to happen through Hijack.
Sure.
We do some things that are kind of architectural in nature, like large-scale furniture, sort of casework type things.
Okay.
And we're doing some more permanent sculptural work, but nothing really architectural
Gotcha.
at this time. And I don't know that I'm pursuing that per se. But yeah, interested in different opportunities as they come up.
Yeah. So does this work inform your design work at studios in any way? Are there things that you're doing at Hijack that you then take into your design work, at studios?
Absolutely, and that's the reason why I started it, was to sort of experiment. And so, I've been very interested in this idea of transparency and creating kind of depth and sort of interest through transparency and through pattern making.
Okay.
And that's one of the things that I brought to several different projects at studios, is the kind of things that I learned about patterning and things that I learned about transparency show up in different aspects of the different projects that I've been working on. We worked on the Georgetown Continuing School of Education down in Chinatown here in DC.
Okay. Cool.
And part of that project is this kind of perforated metal screen that has a really interesting pattern on it. And I think it was through my work at Hijack, when I designed the pattern for that screen, that sort of kind of intuitive design experience of, well, this is going to be an interesting pattern to create a sense of interest in this kind of atrium space.
Yeah.
I think it really kind of came through in that project. And there have been other projects where patterning has been a really important thing.
You mentioned several projects now here in DC over the course of the last several minutes. And you've been in DC quite a long time. And you a Catholic grad, Catholic University of America?
I have taught there.
Taught there,
yes,
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And your degrees are actually, where are they? Tulane and
Harvard.
And Harvard,
Yeah.
so not terrible. So now that you've been here in DC, how does DC influence what you do? Is it a good place to live and work? What has your professional life been like here in DC? Would you recommend it to our audience? What's it like here in DC?
Yeah, I would say that there are tremendous opportunities here in DC. There are a lot of design firms here, and the work that the firms are getting, I think, has improved a lot in the last decade. Previously, if there was a really interesting design project in DC, because of the proximity to New York, a lot of developers or
That's a good point.
Owners would go to New York to find, the high design architect. And I think that attitude is changing here in DC. Studios, we get a lot of work that might have gone to a New York firm, years ago.
Gotcha.
But now they're just sort of seeing that there's actually a lot of talent here in DC too. So I think there's a lot of opportunity on the architecture side. And then, things like Hijack, that I don't know that would have been very successsill in New York. At least
why do you say
not
that?
so quickly. I think you get a lot of opportunities here as a young designer. There's a very large interest in art here in DC. DC has a lot of interest in art, and I think art curators here are very interested in working with DC-based artists, and so there's definitely a lot of opportunity, and maybe less competition than
Sure,
in a place like
totally.
New York. So.
Yeah, there's almost a thirst for it here,
Yeah.
more so than in an oversaturated market like New York, like in LA, like a San Francisco, which I think brings up a great point overall. Like cities where you can find opportunities are sometimes better places to start than a place that is full of every designer already. Your New Yorks, your San Franciscos, your LAs.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a great point. To wrap it up here, I want to kind of give some advice to our audience. A lot of folks here are finishing up their last year of school, on the cusp of graduation next May. What advice would you give to those folks coming out of school, whether it's professionally, whether it's personally? What would you say to somebody who's about to graduate?
I think I would say, try to get as much experience as you can quickly, and by that I mean, test out what you want. So I worked for a small firm, and then I worked for a large firm, and now I work for a medium firm.
So you had the gamut there.
And so that helps me, because I had those three different experiences, it helps me kind of understand kind of really what I wanted, as an architect, and what types of projects I wanted to work on. And again, working at studios, being able to work on many different types of architecture is an important thing for me. So I think it's the main thing for me would be to just kind of get yourself out there, meet as many people as you can, and try to get as many different experiences as you can before deciding that this is the path for me.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. I would echo it too. The more exploration and experimentation you can do for the first 10 years of your career give you more focus and more confidence in the second 10 years of your career. Probably.
I think so. I think that's right.
Yeah. That's great advice. Hiroshi, thanks so much for joining us on the show this week. Appreciate having you. And we'll see you next time on the Ask an Architect Show.